In ancient Rome, there was a job so disgusting that workers permanently lost their sense of smell within weeks. Their skin would literally burn off from the chemicals they worked with daily. And the worst part? Their own families wouldn't touch them. But compared to some ancient professions, these workers were lucky. Today, we're diving into the most revolting jobs in ancient history. Occupations so horrific that execution might have been a mercy. We romanticize ancient civilizations for their philosophy, architecture, and culture. But behind every marble statue and golden temple was an army of workers doing jobs that would make your worst nightmare look pleasant. These weren't just dirty jobs. They were hereditary curses. If your father cleaned cesspits, you cleaned cesspits. If your mother collected corpses, you collected corpses. For thousands of people across the ancient world, life meant waking up every day to face horrors we can barely imagine. But before we explore these nightmare professions, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss our upcoming videos on ancient torture methods and medical practices that killed more people than plagues. Now, let's start with a job that literally made workers reek of death. Forever. Outside every major Roman city stood forests of crosses. Not empty ones. These execution grounds were never cleared. Bodies were left to rot as warnings, creating massive fields of death that stretched for miles. But here's what history books don't tell you. Someone had to clean those fields. Meet the carnifices' assistants, the lowest of the low in Roman society. These workers had one job: retrieve whatever was left of crucifixion victims after weeks of exposure. And trust me, after weeks in the sun with vultures and wild dogs feeding, there wasn't much left. The job started before dawn. Workers would approach the crosses carrying long poles with hooks, not to take bodies down gently, but to fight off the packs of wild dogs that guarded their meals. Many workers lost fingers or worse to starving animals protecting their feast. But the animals were the least of their problems. Crucifixion victims often took days to die. Their bodies would bloat in the heat, filling with gases. One wrong move while removing them, and the corpse would literally explode, covering workers in fluids that had been fermenting in the desert sun for weeks. Roman writer Artemidorus documented that these workers developed a condition called death skin. Their flesh would permanently absorb the smell of decay. No amount of washing could remove it. They were banned from public baths, temples, and markets. Even prostitutes refused their money. The pay? 3 times what a normal laborer made. The life expectancy? Less than 5 years on the job. Most died from diseases caught from the corpses. Others simply vanished, assumed to have been taken by the wild animals they fought daily. But if you think handling decomposing bodies was bad, wait until you hear about the people who stood knee-deep in human waste. By choice. See those pristine white togas that Roman senators wore? That brilliant white color came from one ingredient: human urine. Gallons and gallons of human urine. Enter the fullones, ancient Rome's most essential yet most disgusting workers. Every morning, fullones would make rounds to Rome's public toilets, collecting fresh urine in massive clay jars. But here's where it gets truly revolting. Fresh urine wasn't strong enough. They needed it fermented. These workers would store urine for weeks until it transformed into pure ammonia. The smell was so intense that fullers' workshops had to be located outside city walls. Even then, citizens complained about the stench carrying for miles on the wind. But collecting was just the beginning. The real horror came in the fulling vats. Workers would spend 10 to 12 hours a day standing knee-deep in fermented urine, stomping on clothes to clean them. The ammonia was so strong it would eat through their skin. Archaeological evidence shows fullers' toe bones were often deformed from chemical burns. Their feet would crack and bleed, creating open wounds that soaked in more urine every day. Roman physician Pliny the Elder wrote that fullers developed a condition where their sweat turned to pure ammonia. They couldn't cry without their tears burning their faces. Their children were born with respiratory problems from the fumes. The social stigma was even worse than the physical torture. Fullers were banned from religious ceremonies. Priests claimed they were permanently unclean. They couldn't testify in court because judges said the smell would corrupt justice. Marriage contracts from Pompeii show parents specifically forbidding their daughters from marrying fullers. When Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii, archaeologists found a fuller's workshop with something heartbreaking: small toys hidden in the corner. Even fullers' children were forbidden from playing with other kids. The smell had marked the entire family as outcasts. But believe it or not, standing in urine was luxurious compared to our next profession. They only worked at night. Not by choice, but by law. They were forbidden from showing their faces during daylight. These were the gong farmers, the men who kept ancient cities from drowning in their own waste. Before sewers, every home and business had cesspits, deep holes that collected human waste. When full, someone had to empty them by hand. That someone was a gong farmer, and their job was literally deadly. Armed with nothing but wooden buckets and crude shovels, these workers would lower themselves into pits of human waste that had been fermenting for months. The gases were so toxic that many farmers employed young boys as canaries, sending them down first to see if they'd survive. London records from the medieval period show that 1 in 4 gong farmers died on the job. The lucky ones passed out from methane gas and suffocated quickly. The unlucky ones fell through weak cesspit walls into neighboring pits where they drowned in sewage. But the true horror was a condition called the gong farmer's curse. Constant exposure to human waste created a perfect storm of diseases. Workers developed permanent dysentery, meaning they constantly leaked waste themselves. Their skin would break out in weeping sores that never healed. Most horrifying of all, many developed parasitic worms that would crawl out of their bodies while they slept. One Roman account describes a gong farmer whose intestinal worms grew so large they were visible moving under his skin. He continued working for 3 more years before dying, because no other job would take him. Gong farmers were paid extraordinarily well, often 10 times a regular laborer's wage. But money meant nothing when you couldn't spend it. They were banned from taverns, refused service at markets, and forced to live in designated unclean districts outside city walls. The worst part, it was hereditary. Gong farmer families intermarried because no one else would have them. Children born into these families had no choice. Society wouldn't let them escape their inherited curse. Speaking of inherited curses, our next job was so spiritually contaminating that workers were considered damned for eternity. We've all heard of Egyptian mummification, the sacred art of preparing pharaohs for the afterlife. What they don't tell you is that most embalmers lived lives of absolute horror. While high priests performed ritual ceremonies, the actual dirty work fell to the unclean class of embalmers. These workers handled every rotting corpse in Egypt, not just royalty, but anyone who could afford preservation. The process started with the brain. Using a long bronze hook inserted through the nose, workers would spend hours liquefying and extracting brain matter. But in Egypt's desert heat, bodies decomposed fast. Often the brain had already turned to putrid liquid that would spray out under pressure, covering workers in infected tissue. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes embalmers suffering from a condition called corpse lung, a respiratory disease caused by constantly inhaling decay particles. Workers coughed up black phlegm mixed with pieces of the dead. Most developed permanent breathing problems by age 30. But the physical suffering was nothing compared to the spiritual torture. Egyptian religion taught that touching the dead made you spiritually unclean. Embalmers were banned from temples, forbidden from religious festivals, and couldn't even pray to most gods. They were literally damned, cut off from the afterlife they spent their lives preparing others for. Archaeological digs have found embalmer villages completely separated from other communities. These settlements had their own wells because regular Egyptians believed embalmers would contaminate shared water. Children of embalmers couldn't attend regular schools. They had their own markets because touching money an embalmer had handled was considered cursed. The irony was crushing. These workers dedicated their lives to ensuring others reached paradise, knowing they themselves were barred from it forever. Modern analysis of embalmer remains shows evidence of numerous diseases: tuberculosis from corpse exposure, severe arthritis from repetitive motions, and mysterious bone deformities scientists still can't explain. One theory suggests constant exposure to natron actually mummified embalmers while they were still alive, slowly turning their living tissue into leather. Of all the horrific jobs in ancient history, perhaps none required as much stomach-churning precision as the parasitic worm extractors of ancient Greece and Egypt. The guinea worm was humanity's nightmare for millennia. This parasite would grow inside human bodies for a year, reaching lengths of up to 3 feet. When ready to emerge, it would create burning blisters on the skin and slowly crawl out. The pain was so intense that victims would plunge the affected limb into water for relief, exactly what the worm wanted to release its larvae. Enter the worm extractors, specialists who remove these parasites using a technique so delicate that one mistake meant death. The process was torture. When the worm began emerging, the extractor would grab its head and slowly wind it around a stick. Too fast, and the worm would break, releasing toxins that caused fatal septic shock. Too slow, and the patient would go mad from pain. Each extraction took weeks. The extractor would wind the worm a few centimeters each day, all while the patient screamed in agony. The worm would try to retract back into the body, requiring the extractor to maintain constant tension. They couldn't sleep, couldn't leave their patient's side. But here's the truly horrifying part. Extractors often became infected themselves. Greek physician Agatharchides wrote about extractors who had dozens of worms removed from their own bodies over their careers. They knew the job would eventually kill them, but the pay was too good to refuse. One account describes an extractor who had so many worm scars that his skin looked like tree bark. The social stigma was devastating. People believed worm extractors carried the parasites with them. They were forced to wear special marked clothing, warning others to stay away. Their tools were considered cursed. If an extractor died, their instruments were buried with them because no one would touch them. Recent archaeological finds in Egypt uncovered an extractor's toolkit alongside the skeleton of its owner. Analysis showed he had suffered from at least 15 separate worm infections. His bones showed signs of chronic malnutrition, likely because vendors refused to sell him food, fearing contamination. The most heartbreaking discovery? A child's toy buried with him. Even this man's own family wouldn't visit his grave. These were the invisible people who kept ancient civilizations running. Without fullers, Rome would have had no clean clothes. Without gong farmers, cities would have drowned in waste. Without embalmers, Egyptian culture couldn't exist. Without worm extractors, parasites would have decimated populations. Yet society treated them worse than criminals. They were banned from temples, refused basic services, and condemned to pass their cursed professions to their children. They suffered isolation, disease, and early death, all while performing jobs that society desperately needed but refused to acknowledge. The next time you complain about your job, remember the Fullones standing knee-deep in fermented urine, their skin burning off day by day. Remember the gong farmers suffocating in cesspits, dying in the dark so others could live in the light. Remember the embalmers, damned for eternity for preparing others for paradise. These weren't just the worst jobs in history. They were hereditary life sentences that made death look like mercy. And the most tragic part? Someone had to do them. In every glorious ancient civilization we admire, thousands lived in unimaginable horror to keep society functioning. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not despite how disgusting they are, but because of it. They remind us that every civilization is built on the suffering of those it chooses to forget. If this video shocked you, wait until you see what's next. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because next week we're revealing ancient medical practices so horrifying they killed more patients than diseases. From drilling holes in skulls to cure headaches to using crocodile dung as birth control. You won't believe what passed for medicine in the ancient world. Comment below which disgusting ancient job horrified you the most, and don't forget to share this video with someone who thinks their job is bad. Trust me, after watching this, they'll never complain about Monday mornings again.